Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Leon Hartwell. Welcome to another LSE IDEAS Russia-Ukraine Dialogue. We are part-funded by PeaceRep, an international research project led by the University of Edinburgh Law School, which delivers research and tracks data on conflict and its resolution. Since the February 2022 escalation of the Russia-Ukraine war, we have claimed that the conflict will have major spillover effects for people and countries way beyond the borders of the two adversaries. That observation remains true, including with regards to the impact of the conflict on African countries and people. To discuss these issues, I'd like to welcome three very distinguished guests. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Ambassador Liubov Abravitova, Ukraine's ambassador to South Africa, although I should mention she covers 10 countries from her post, and she is also accredited as ambassador to Mozambique and Botswana. Secondly, I'd like to welcome Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, Chief Executive of the South African Institute of International Affairs, or SIA, one of the top think tanks in Africa based in Johannesburg. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome Abdelhak Bassou, Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South, which I should also add is a leading African think tank based in Rabat, Morocco. Welcome to all three of our panelists. I'm going to kick off this discussion by first turning to Ambassador Abravitova. Now, if you could unmute for me, please, Liubov. What is it like being a Ukrainian ambassador serving your nation in several African countries during this particular period? And how have African officials been responding to your calls to speak out against Russian aggression and atrocities in Ukraine? Thank you.
Good day, everyone, and thank you for this initiative, Leon, for gathering us to discuss this important issue, particularly in Africa. I would never probably think that I would be asked this question, how it feels to be the ambassador during war times. And definitely there's something that no one was teaching me during my university times. You know, I'm a career diplomat, but this is something that we are not talking about at the lectures because you're speaking about peace building, crisis prevention, etc. That's why I think it's really interesting to see how diplomatic responses are around the world and to get it from the point that each particular country of accreditation, having its different background and different relationship, shows the different reaction on the Russian aggression in Ukraine, but not only at aggression, but also at those war crimes and atrocities that Russia is committing. We definitely have to remind to all our and to ourselves and to our viewers that we are in the war with Russia since 2014, and that Russia annexed Crimea in 2014, and then it was committing its crimes in Donbass. Millions of people were internally displaced, thousands were killed, and already during that time we had and we were to see what were the reactions on international arena towards those violations. And when we are coming closer to the 24th of February 2022, we already can see that the reactions were not that unexpected as some people were seeing them. And particularly speaking about South African reaction or the position towards Russian aggression and violation of the UN Charter. So the reaction was unfortunate, but was predictable, I would say. Why I'm saying unfortunate? Because basically what we are seeing today and what we've been seeing through many years of existence of independent Russia or post-Soviet Russia is the attempt to restore its colonial appetites. And there's something that definitely should have been of the pain for many African countries. those who went through the liberation movements, those who went through the struggle with apartheid. I always try to see the situation from both points of view, from point of view of Ukraine, but also from the country where I'm accredited. And no one of us was ready for this outbreak of full-scale invasion, nor Ukraine, nor South Africa. And that is why the initial absence of the reaction, and I'm sure my colleagues will touch on this. Yeah, we did see the statement from the DIRCO of South Africa saying that Russia immediately has to remove its troops from the territory of Ukraine. And that initial move was very natural, because this is what the UN Charter is about. But then that shock that came after, because three-day operation was not stopping and the resistance was huge, and the number of consequences, including the reactions that came with this invasion, that actually Putin didn't anticipate on different levels, starting from Ukraine internally, within our society, and finishing with the global unity of the world. So I would say that the reaction across the countries of my responsibility were more or less the same in terms of shock, and it took a lot of consultations and time for these consultations for them to figure out what would be the position. And secondly, what unites all of them is that many were trying not to get involved into the conflict, and I'm quoting here, which does not belong to the continent and which is happening far away from Southern African region. So to say, let them solve their own regional issues as we are trying to solve ours ourselves. So it was a bit of protective move, which also was very much supported and maybe stimulated by Russian Federation, because it did anticipate what kind of reaction can come from certain countries. And the narrative of that, we'll come back to that further, granted to Russia a lot of silence towards Russian aggression in Ukraine. Let me finish here.
Thank you, Liubov. Thank you for that insight also, and we'll hope to hear more about some of those personal dealings at some point, for sure. Elizabeth, I'm going to ask you a kind of related question also that touched on some of the issues that the ambassador was talking about, and I can also just mention to our audience, we'll probably spend a lot of time on South Africa today because we have two panelists here who are, focusing on South Africa, but also arguably because South Africa plays a fairly large role in the diplomatic sphere. The ambassador is currently sitting in the capital that hosts the second most foreign missions in the world after Washington, D.C. So South Africa has weight and has clout around the continent. But Elizabeth, perhaps you could characterize, you could elaborate on South Africa's position on the Russia-Ukraine war. In practice, what does that position matter? And how is that position any different from other states on the African continent? Thank you, Elizabeth.
Great, thank you, Leon, and good to see you, and good to be on the panel with colleagues. Let me start with the first point around characterizing South Africa's position on the Russian invasion. South Africa, if you look at all of its statements in the UN General Assembly, has focused on sort of being non-aligned, that it doesn't want to take sides, either on the one or the other, that dialogue is important, that wars tend to end with negotiations, with dialogue. That, of course, is also the template That's the way in which post-apartheid South Africa certainly has engaged on conflicts in the continent. You yourself, Leon, know quite well with our various engagements in Zimbabwe, in the DRC, in Burundi, in Sudan, South Sudan, have all been about bringing parties to the table, having them negotiate. And we can argue, and I think there is a discussion to be had about whether that works in this current context, because we've also seen in the South African context, in our engagements across the continent, our template doesn't always work, and I think there's been some introspection about why in certain places it may work and in others it might, or it might work initially, but it might not work in the longer term. So that's been South Africa's focus at the UN General Assembly. And it has also made the point that, of course, the United Nations Security Council has become paralyzed, that this highlights again the fact that the UN needs to be reformed, and particularly, of course, the Security Council needs to be reformed. I would argue that I don't know if an expanded Security Council would necessarily have been more effective than the one now, given the circumstances. South Africa has also been a part, and I think it's important to note that the very first statement, as the ambassador said, actually called for Russian troops to withdraw. In subsequent statements, including in some press engagements in the early part of the war, there was again from DIRCO, from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, statements about this is a violation of the Charter. I'm not quoting now, but it is we do not condone this violation of the Charter, or words to that effect. But in every occasion at the UN General Assembly, South Africa has steered away from mentioning Russia specifically as the belligerent, because it says that sort of undermines the ability, or it makes it much more difficult to actually be able to bring the parties to a negotiation. It makes the debate much more polarized, and therefore is not constructive. And South Africa has also, during last year, said, well, we'd be happy to help to negotiate the end, although there hasn't been any concrete sort of steps in that regard. Why does it matter? Well, I think the first point to say is that different countries on the continent have taken different positions. The most notable, I think, was the position of Kenya, who was also serving on the UN Security Council at the time, and that I thought very good statement by the permanent rep, Ambassador Kimani, on why for Africa, violations of territorial integrity, changes in borders were really a bad thing. A position of the AU, of the OAU before that was really, the way in which Berlin carved up Africa is not great. It doesn't follow the way in which we might have done it had we had the opportunity to do it, but actually that keeping the boundaries as they are is something we have to respect. Otherwise, we're opening ourselves up to many more problems. And there is the dimension of colonialism, I think. But I think the interesting debate here, and particularly in Southern Africa, is that while some academics here, certainly at the time, characterized the way in which we must see what happened in Ukraine as a former colonial power trying to reassert itself, the irony is that a lot of the narrative in the global South discussion, particularly in Africa, focuses on what the West has done, and specifically the fact that the West is the former colonial masters in Africa, and the way in which they have engaged with the continent, the way in which they've engaged with South Africa, for example, that South Africa needs to take a particular position, is reminiscent of that behavior, that sort of colonial behavior that the West has been responsible for on the continent. So I think that there are different narratives here. I think some big countries have taken different positions from South Africa. The voting patterns over time have changed depending on the issue. There's always been a significant number that have abstained, but there's also been a significant number that have supported many of the resolutions. I think in SADC, the history, the legacy of national liberation struggles and support by the Soviet Union at the time show a particular picture, whereas if you go into East Africa and maybe West Africa, the picture is a little different. South Africa is an important player on the continent. It's not the only important player, and so I think there is countries coalesce around different countries that represent or with which they agree on this, but there is by no means a sort of, South Africa sort of getting all the continent to agree with its particular position. One thing that is clear is clearly that most African countries don't want to become involved in what they see largely as a European war. We can argue whether that is a European war, and they're concerned about the impact on food security, on rising prices of energy, and so on. Let me stop there.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Those are great points, and I think we're particularly going to come back also to two of the prominent issues that you raised on this issue of colonialism, the colonialism narrative, as well as this issue of quote-unquote Soviet support, what that means. But before we do that, let's turn to Abdelhak first, joining us from Morocco. Abdelhak, welcome again. It's great to see you. What is Morocco's official position about the war? Furthermore, according to a variety of media reports, and I have to ask you this, Morocco has supplied Ukraine with tanks. If that's the case, it would be the first African state to send heavy weapons to Ukraine. What precipitated the move and how significant is it in the African context? Thank you.
Thank you, Leon. I think let's start with Morocco's position regarding the war in Ukraine. There is two principles that drive Moroccan foreign policy. First, it's the territorial integrity of all United Nations countries and the resolution of conflicts by peaceful means. And we see those positions in the Moroccan vote at the Assembly, the General Assembly of the United Nations. Now, when it comes to just qualify Russia as an aggressor, Morocco has been absent. When it comes to suspend the Russian membership in the structure of human rights, Morocco has been absent. But when it comes to condemn the annexation of Ukrainian territories, Morocco votes in favor of the resolution. When it comes to the call for the withdrawal of Russian troops from the Ukrainian territories, Morocco votes in favor of the resolution. If you want to have a resume, Morocco doesn't want to confront Russia or to blame it, but Morocco cannot accept what is happening with Ukraine. Now, when it comes to this question of delivering tanks to Ukraine, we have no information coming from sources that are really believable. Morocco have denied it. The Moroccan Ministry of Foreign Affairs denied it, that Morocco have delivered the tanks. But when a European responsible came to Morocco, he said that Morocco have delivered tanks to, and the minister who was near to him have said nothing. Second thing, I think it's not question of tanks, but of spare parts of tanks. And I think in this question, is part of the fog that surrounds this war. Morocco, I think, supports Ukraine in his cause because Morocco is against any annexation of territories. But in the same time, Morocco doesn't want to appear as confronting Russia. And that's the case of a lot of African countries. There is some African countries who are against what Russia is doing, but they don't want to confront Russia. There is some other African countries who are just against the West. They want to support Ukraine, but they don't want to support the West. Then we can ask what does it mean in the African context? And I think, as Elizabeth has said before, there is no African contest. There is 24 African contests. Each country in Africa takes the position that seems to suit to its interest. Donc, some buy weapons from Russia, others get their supplies elsewhere, other depends on Ukrainian weight, other on Russian weight or elsewhere. Some are anti-Western, others are pro-Western. And then I think the longer the war will be, and the longer Africans will be conscientious of what Russia is doing. And I think the future in Africa is for Ukraine. Some Africans doesn't want to condemn Russia. They want that it will be a question of days or weeks. But the longer the war is, and the longer I think the African will be conscious of the danger that Russia is representing for the world and for Africa and for everything. Let's stop here, I think.
Thank you, Abdelhak. Those are some interesting points, and maybe you'll tell me if I come visit you in Morocco about this tanks deal. We'll have a discussion about that. But so no official confirmation from Morocco at present. Let's go back to you, Liubov. You were talking earlier, you mentioned that your current struggle in Ukraine is akin to African struggles against colonialism and imperialism. Can you elaborate on what are the similarities between African struggles against colonialism and your struggle for freedom from Russian colonialism or imperialism, however you want to define it? Thank you.
Thank you. Let me make it very clear, because all the time when I'm speaking at different panel discussions and at different lectures, I'm calling on my colleagues not to look at Africa as something single in their opinion, not conglomerative, because differently, and indeed different histories, different experiences, different pains. And probably the only pain that unites almost all Africa is that colonialism issue. And that's why I mentioned that. For me, it's, and for Ukraine, I mean, it's a lot of similarities in terms of the reasons of war and means of war and consequences of war that Russia is making today. So we are speaking about the reasons as the desire to get control over the territory and resources. We see it when Russians are coming to our territories. When we deliberate those areas, we see that they are taking out all possible resources of there. I'm not speaking only about natural ones, but about all the facilities, all the plants that were basically looted by Russians. We are speaking about the elimination of self-identity and violations of human rights. On that level, I see as well the similarity. And when we are speaking about consequences, these are the issues that are coming up now, starting with the violations of rules and norms of democracy and international law, but also the food crisis, the energy crisis, and all other repercussions that are coming from there. Interestingly enough, that we've seen this attitude of Russia since the collapse of USSR. If we just remember Georgia, if we remember Moldova, if we look now at Belarus, which has become a real classical proxy of Russia. So it's a lot of parallels that you can find in mentioning this. And I did like the point Professor made, our Moroccan colleague, that many countries don't want to confront Russia, even though they had this similarity in the history. But they don't want to confront. I would say they don't want Putin and his regime to be humiliated with their hands, with their assistance. Am I right, Professor? Yeah, so this is the point. Everyone understands that it's not right, but to participate in that, this is the challenge. And what I see today when we are trying to foresee how we are going after the peace established, we call it victory because we know that the only way we can go out of that is the victory of Ukraine. But when the peace established, how we can restore justice. And we are working to establish the mechanisms, the new ones that will work. And we are inviting all the countries, and the reluctance of particularly African countries in that shows me that this is the issue, that probably African countries don't want to be the part of the process. And then the narrative that comes in some countries that position themselves just against Europe. We can blame them for this, we cannot agree on that, but it is a real situation where we find ourselves, and we will need to deal with that further. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. And I think this issue of colonialism and the parallels also, it's such an important issue worth exploring further. And that's not just in the African context. I do think our understanding, not just of Russia, but Central and Eastern Europe, is very much Russocentric, also in Europe and in the US. A lot of our understanding of these places are fed through particular lenses. So I hope it's something we can talk about more in our dialogues going forward. But let's first turn back again to Elizabeth, because earlier you talked about that kind of Soviet Union legacy. ANC cadres received military training in various parts of the Soviet Union, including in Ukraine, of course. And according to at least one source, there was an ANC training camp in Odessa where 328 cadres were trained between 1963 and 1965. Yet Soviet support for the African National Congress, the ruling party in South Africa currently, during the anti-apartheid struggle is by and large strictly attributed these days to Russia, even by the ANC. How has Russia, if we want to talk about this, colonized the Soviet liberation credentials? Was it through information campaigns, financial dealings with the Kremlin? What's your perspective on this issue?
Thanks, Leon. I wonder if I can just make one observation on the comments made by Abdelhak earlier and by the ambassador. I think one of the points that is part of the thinking of many African countries, and I would argue countries in the global south, about whether we want to confront Russia or not, is that point about anti-West, but more specifically about a desire to see a much more multipolar world. And this is part of that dynamic. You know, what has happened in Ukraine and the way in which the West has responded, the rise of China, China's engagement, and because I think the Russia-Ukraine war also plays out against that bigger canvas, I think is something that is important for global South countries. It reduces, it counterbalances the hegemony as they have seen it of the West, and particularly of the United States. But let me come to your point about Russia sort of taking for itself the legacy of Soviet liberation credentials. I think it's a number of reasons. Firstly, after the fall, the collapse of the Soviet Union, of course, Russia inherited all of the Soviet Union's diplomatic footprint. Apart from the fact that it is, you know, in international law, the legal successor of the Soviet Union, it inherited all of that footprint. So all of the other states, all of the other 14 states had to build up that diplomatic footprint from scratch. Certainly, if we think back to the 1990s, the primary focus in those days, including for Russia, was the West and Europe. Okay, that was the most important focus, and so Russia itself turned away from Africa. It really scaled down its engagement. Primakov, I think, in the late 1990s, bemoaned the fact that we had they had turned away from Africa and so on. And I think from 2006 onwards, you see a gradual re-engagement of Russia. You see the first state visit by President Putin in 2006, and then I suppose the culmination is 2019 with the Sochi summit. Ukraine and indeed other countries haven't had the benefit of a diplomatic footprint, have had to build it up from scratch. I think Ukraine's focus, I think it would be true to say, has been on joining the European Union, becoming a member of NATO. I think there is a diplomatic footprint. It doesn't rival that of Russia. And I think over the years, until I think the last couple of years, Ukraine hasn't sort of seen Africa hasn't gone into Africa in the way in which we've seen the Russians do in the recent years, to really build up its partnerships and links. That is not a criticism, but I think it's just different priorities and so on. So that's one dimension. And the other one clearly is the way in which Russia going in has emphasized its national liberation credentials. It's often not seen as, strictly speaking, global South, but it's positions itself as a partner of Southern countries against the West when they were fighting colonialism. And clearly, a lot of the guys who were engaging with African leaders also are Russian. They come from Russia, so some of these are reinforced. But absolutely, that's not the full picture. And I think at an elite level, I think there has been a lot of engagement and a lot of effort. I mean, we see that also in the South African context with the nuclear deal and so on. And so the financial dimension, particularly with where you're lacking transparency and so on, I think is something not to be underestimated. Certainly in the South African case, we've seen through the disclosure of political party funding over the last couple of years that oligarchs have provided funding to the ANC. So these are all part of the mix, but I think it's not a unitary explanation. I think it's quite a complex picture.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And yes, of course, as you point out, it both comes from Ukraine's priorities that have been somewhat different over the last few years versus Russia's. But then there are all these other factors also playing in, including the financial dealings that are sometimes quite dubious. Let's talk about the Wagner Group. And for this question, I'm going to turn to Abdelhak because of your expertise. What do we know about the Wagner Group's activities on the African continent? And importantly, do you think those activities impact on the Russia-Ukraine war? Thank you.
Thank you. Just one word about when I said that some Africans doesn't want to confront Russia. And that's my opinion. When it comes to Russia now, Russia has no capacity of influence, nor economic, nor military, and now they show they have no military influence. But Russia has a huge nuisance capacity. And that's what some African countries want to avoid. They want to avoid the nuisance capacity of Russia. Now, when it comes to Wagner, you know, Russia does not have the economic means like those of its rivals in Africa, such as China, USA, Europe, United Kingdom, Japan, or even Turkey. Therefore, it cannot compete with them in the normal way. Russia is therefore obliged to use marginal ways and marginal process in Africa. But on the other hand, Russia is member of the Security Council of the United States, and it can't recognize officially that it's using marginal ways. Then she uses Wagner as a fuse. She takes advantage of Wagner's action while saying to have no ties with Wagner. I think Wagner still not be allowed to exercise in Russia. It's not allowed. It's not recognized. Even now in Bakhmut, when Russian talks about Wagner, they don't say Wagner. They say volunteers or organization. Now, for Africans, in Africa, Russia benefits from Wagner's transactions in the field of exploitation of mines, of riches, in devious means, because Wagner uses devious means without bearing the breaches to international law that Wagner commits. Today in Mali, for example, and probably tomorrow in Burkina. If Wagner succeeds, Russia will claim victory. And if Wagner fails, they will say they don't know what is Wagner. I think Africans must know that all the agreements and transactions they have with Wagner are agreements on the margin of international law. Africans must know this. They have to interiorize with something that legally doesn't exist.
Thank you, Abdelhak. Thank you for that perspective also. Let's turn again to the ambassador again. Both you, if you're standing in front of any of these African officials where you are accredited as ambassador, what would be your message to them? Why should African states and Africans care about the Russia-Ukraine war?
Well, as I told, it would be, generally speaking, for each particular country, about the values. And let me stress here, not about European on Western or Western values, the global values, the democratic values of the world. And that's why I'll be speaking to every particular president or minister about this. I would be speaking about the UN Charter, to which all of us adhere. That's why it is important. But also, I would speak about consequences. What in short term, after the full-scale invasion started, particularly each African country felt, showed the importance, let me speak for my country, of Ukraine, for the food security, for the energy security. We are not paying enough of attention to ecological security, which is heavily damaged. What about nuclear security? That one I would be really definitely touch on with South Africa. Ukraine was the country that abandoned its nuclear arsenal, one of the largest in the world at that time, for the security guarantees of the country that basically now is violating not only that treaty, but all the security setup. This is something that I would speak to small countries, such as Eswatini and Lesotho, saying to them, are we really want to have an equal rights and equal voices towards the bigger countries? Or is that something that we have to close our eyes on when the big country can come and say, I like that piece of your land and that resources, let me take it. Or I don't like that your language prevails in your country. Let me put my language there. And these are all the sensitive issues for South Africa and for African countries. I would be speaking about the immigrational issues, about the responses to internally displaced people. This is not the war somewhere far from Africa. This is the war of different scale. It's not that any conflict in the world is not that important as Ukrainian. As a diplomat, as woman, as mother, I'm always saying, we feel, all of us, the same pain when we're losing our relatives, our friends, but this war is different because the scope and the danger that it causes today to the world is of that scale that the world never seen since the end of the Second World War. It is, though, giving opportunities for African countries, and that's what I would be speaking to them about. Because every war will be over. It's clearly recognized how important Ukraine and what kind of experience we had, but also we have been receiving, which is of a value for many African countries. I would say this. I would say that Ukraine, after the victory, will be the hub of opportunities and of investments, and that these are the African opportunities for the new working places, for the new knowledge and education, and many, many other things.
Thank you. I hope we definitely will hear more about some of those opportunities. And it was interesting last year in Morocco when I joined Abdelhak and his colleagues. I think there was consensus that, of course, this war has massive implications also for a range of African states. Of course, there were some who somehow indirectly benefited from the energy crisis, but there were others that were suffering tremendously. And there was certainly consensus that that this war not necessarily caused the food security crisis on the continent, but definitely exacerbated it. The one thing that was never talked about was this risk of nuclear war, which of course, the chances of that happening is small, but if it happens, the consequences are large, which I do think is something that needs to be discussed more in the global south, perhaps. Elizabeth, let's turn to you again. South Africa recently hosted a joint military exercise with Russia. And shortly before it occurred, the legal scholar Nicole Fritz published an interesting article arguing that South Africa may be breaching international law. What did she mean by that, and what are your thoughts on that particular line of argument? Thank you.
Thanks, Leon. I have to start by a caveat and say that unlike Nicole, who's a brilliant legal scholar, I'm neither brilliant nor a legal scholar. But I mean, I've read the article, and I've also looked at taken a closer look at the naval exercises and the specifics of it. I mean, her argument is that in international law, states are under an obligation not to recognize as lawful a situation created by a serious breach. A serious breach would certainly be a prohibition, would be an act of aggression. So prohibition on aggression is obviously one of the dimensions that responsible states need to be mindful of. Nor are such states then where a state has breached international law, should they render aid or assistance in maintaining that situation that breach has brought about. So in the context, she argues in the context of the naval exercises then, and particularly at that time, there was a discussion about whether the Russians were going to test the Zircon missile, which could potentially then be deployed in Ukraine. There was a lot of concern that would be very, very obviously potentially such an act. In the event that wasn't tested, but the form of the naval exercises certainly could be seen as intending to improve the capacities of the three navies present. I would say that in terms of the overall ranking of those navies, certainly South Africa is the much smaller one, the one with much more limited capacities. It's an open secret. It's in the various annual defense reports, some of the challenges that both our Navy, our Air Force, and our Army face. But if we are to look at what the naval exercises aimed to do, the Air Force was to simulate various attacks on ships, and ships would then have to defend. Guns on these ships would be fired at naval targets. The ships themselves would practice maneuvering, formation, detecting, and hitting mock-ups of floating mines. One needs to obviously think they're potentially of the Black Sea. And there was also an anti-piracy exercise where a South African Navy vessel was captured by pirates, and then the exercise of liberating. So clearly these are all, they have a dual purpose. Anti-piracy is absolutely a good thing, but there's a dual purpose in terms of the kinds of activities and the training that goes into it. And clearly we have a situation here where Russia is a belligerent state. It is the aggressor and engaged in international armed conflict. And so an exercise such as this, although I'm not an international legal expert, but just looking at it superficially and based on what Nicole Fritz had to say, could potentially be conceived as aiding and supporting, providing assistance to a state that has done a serious breach of international law and been the aggressor. But I'm not sure how such an exercise would possibly stand up in an international court of law. The Zircon missile might be a stronger case, but that's the argument she makes, and certainly I think if we look at it, one can see that there is, that this serves some sort of purpose in terms of ramping up, improving the naval capacities of the 3 participating nations, one of which is a belligerent.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I think it's definitely an interesting argument worth reading Nicole Fritz's piece. Let's stick to this issue of military issues and go to Abdelhak again. You recently wrote a really interesting piece, so I'd like to ask you this question: what was Russia's military power power image in Africa? How has Russia's performance on the battlefield in Ukraine changed that perception? And most importantly, what will be the impact of it? And then I'll throw in just a quick question from one of our audience members who just wanted to latch on to something regarding China. Chloe is asking you, how much influence do China's economic activities and diplomatic role have on the views of governments of Morocco and South Africa in relation to this war? So if you could spend a few seconds on that too. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know about China, but what I can talk about is the military image of Russia in Africa. Like what was believed by the majority of countries in the world, for African too, Russia have been thought as a Greece military power in Africa. In terms of ranking, Russia was the second military power after the United States for African, and I think for the world. The war in Chechnya, I think, in Georgia, in Syria, and confirmed the stature of Russia as a Greece military power, especially as Western powers have let Russia do its thing, and they give the impression to fear Russia. And now, when Africans in 2019 met Russia in the Russian African Summit in Sochi, they have in front of them a Russia that kept Syrian president in power and defeated his enemies, labeled as terrorists. And at this time, Africans admired Russia. But this perception, I think, is disturbed by the image that the Russian army has shown in Ukraine. Russian army appeared devoid of strategy, presented organization vulnerabilities in its chain of command, and very weak in logistic management. Even Russian armament appears effectiveless facing Western armament. Moreover, the resistance of the Ukrainian genius, as well as the support brought by the Westerners, put Russia in front of a more structured adversary than those which it had faced before. In Ukraine, the Russian army showed its true post-USSR face. In Ukraine, we have seen the true image of the Russian army, an army without real resources of power in terms of conventional warfare. No one knows what are the nuclear capabilities of Russia, as those weapons have not been experienced yet. We don't know. Then in Africa, we have some countries, some armies in the countries that have been equipped with the Russian armament syndicates. And I think they are trapped. They can do nothing. But I believe those who have a choice will not choose anymore Russian weaponry, and they will no longer trust in the Russian strategy of war. I think the image of Russian military power in Africa, I think it has decreased.
Yeah, just as a reminder, Russia was seen as the second strongest military power in the world prior to February 2022, and now it's only the second most powerful military in Ukraine, present, as they say. Of course, Russia is also the largest supplier of weapons to the African continent. And as you said, Abdelhak, what happens on the battlefield may also have implications for Russia's ability to sell those weapons on the continent in the future. Abdelhak,
I think we will see it in St. Petersburg in next July. We will see if Africans will go to St. Petersburg.
So next July, we'll have to watch out for that. I have one final question for each of the panelists, and I will just ask you all to be very brief. I know, Abdelhak, you are pressed with time, so I'm going to ask you the first question just briefly, and you can jump off when you are done there. My question to you is, how do you think Ukraine should change its approach to African states in order to garner greater support? And I'm asking this question especially in light of the fact of what you mentioned, that there are some strong, almost natural sympathies from certain parts of the continent. Thank you.
Yes, there is now some movement that sympathized, some countries that sympathized with Ukraine. And I think secretly, all the African continent sympathize with Ukraine. But for diplomatic ties with Russia, for some other reasons they don't reveal, some African countries doesn't want to show, if you know, hostility toward Russia. Now, when it comes to Africa, I think the balance of power between Russia and Ukraine in Africa is favorable to Russia. Moscow has over 40 embassies in Africa and capitalized on, as Elizabeth said, Russia capitalized on the USSR legacy of relations with Africa. But USSR wasn't only Russia, it was Ukraine too. Then Ukraine has to capitalize on the USSR legacy. Ukraine helped African countries before. A lot of African students have studied in Kiev. And those are, I think, then they can constitute a bridge. Those students can constitute a bridge between Ukraine and Africa. Ukraine have announced, I think, that it will be opening some 10 or about 10 embassies in Africa, but does Ukraine now have the means to open those embassies? And even if it's open, can it produce effects before a long time? I think we have to use they have to use civil society. African has about colonialism, because Russia is now trying to colonialize Ukraine. They have to use this. When it comes to weight, Ukraine, I don't know if Ukraine have the means to do it, but to say that my wheat must go to Africa and to have those ties. Something else that makes things difficult for Ukraine. Ukraine doesn't confront only Russia in Africa. China is making pressure on African countries not to condemn Russia. And then there is the Chinese action too. Something else is that I think the Western diplomatic structure in Africa have to help Ukrainian diplomats to introduce them to people, to introduce them to African organization, to help them. They help them militarily. They have to help them diplomatically in Africa.
Thank you, Abdelhak. And I think that's a great message also that Ukraine should not be afraid to lean into a particular part of that Soviet Union history and the relations it had with African states during that particular period. Abdelhak, I know you have to go, so feel free to drop off. I have one more question each for the ambassador and for Elizabeth, but thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I have to leave. I apologize, but I have another meeting.
Thank you. All right, let's final question, Liubov. How do you see the end of the Russia-Ukraine war, and do any African states have a role to play in the lead up to or during the peace process? Thank you.
Thank you for this question. It is very important because we have to think about peace and how we are going to restore our country after all what Russia has been doing. I think Elizabeth was saying in the beginning that there is a lot of experience in South Africa in ending conflicts and negotiating. And it was a good point saying that this template of South Africa doesn't necessarily work for different conflicts. And because it's the real-time conflict, full scale, huge, we don't have time to make our master degree studies and to take one theory and to try to put it on Ukraine, you know. We have to find that solution that will work for Ukraine, for our people, and for the lasting peace, not only in the region, but in the world. And that's what makes this very complicated. So we've seen quite a number of different initiatives, including Chinese, by the way. It was very clearly worked out and presented by President Zelensky, his peace formula, which is 10 points formula, which addresses the main issues and repercussions of the Russian aggression. And the last 10 point, which is exactly the peaceful agreement between Ukraine and Russia, which can be reached only when we meet certain circumstances. So I will not go into the details of this 10-point peace formula, but important maybe to mention that this initiative is open for every country in full, or just to pick up one of the points, 1 of 10, and to join all the world to do our system stable and to provide Ukraine with guarantees, not only Ukraine, but all those countries that today are threatened by Russia, to provide those security guarantees that Russia cannot ever have even this appetite to go to another country and to take what belongs not to Russia. Thank you.
Thank you. Some interesting points for sure. And as a scholar of conflict resolution, I'm of course always trying to identify a peaceful end to a conflict. But I don't think people always realize how difficult it is if the conditions on the battlefield are not conducive to finding that peaceful way out. Elizabeth, I'm going to ask you the final question for today's session. Thank you also for all the contributions earlier, but this is a very kind of topical question right now in light of the ICC arrest warrant for Mr. Putin, South Africa will be hosting the BRICS summit in August. Due to the newly issued ICC arrest warrant, South Africa is, of course, bound by international law to arrest Putin should he attend. In practice, what do you think will happen, Elizabeth?
So yeah, so I think this is the big diplomatic conundrum that I think since Friday, I'm sure the South African government is thinking about. The presidential spokesman indicated that, you know, South Africa is very aware of its international obligations. South Africa played, I think, a very important role in getting the Rome Statute signed up and agreed and finalized, and also played a role, as Judge Richard Goldstone reminded us a few days ago, in mobilizing support from SADC to sign and to ratify the statute. But since then, I think it has as has the rest of the continent, an ambivalent attitude towards it. And in fact, after 2015, when al-Bashir, the Sudanese president, visited as part of an AU summit, and although there was an arrest warrant out for him, and the South African government did not arrest him, the consequences of that was really to push for South Africa to actually leave the ICC. And the ANC took a resolution in 2017, and the government, in truth, kind of delayed it, because I think it realized that this is not, you know, the ICC was a really important development in international law and international justice. Having said that, and in fact, last week, draft legislation that had been tabled to be discussed in Parliament as a result of the 2017 decision was withdrawn, because also the ANC conference a few months ago had actually rescinded that decision. I mean, where that leaves us now. So South Africa is in a very difficult position politically. I think the international legal obligation is very clear. And it's made even more clear, not only by the fact that we've domesticated the Rome Statute, but also by the appellate division, by the Supreme Court of Appeals in 2015, that basically said that, you know, denying that, in fact, even if, you know, the Russian president, which, you know, Russia isn't a signatory to it, it doesn't give South Africa a loophole out of this, where it's the prosecutor that has issued the arrest warrant, that it basically denies all immunity in cases of international crimes, whether or not there is even an ICC arrest warrant. So the legal side is very clear. The political dimension, I think, is very difficult. The easiest way to deal with it is to basically tell President Putin, and we're going to issue you with an invitation, but we really don't want you to accept it. Okay, come up with some reason why you shouldn't come. I'm not sure that they're going to do that. Certainly, some of the alliance partners have been very vocal in condemning the ICC arrest warrant. There might even be a push among members of the ANC, I don't know, to sort of reintroduce the draft legislation. I don't know how quickly it will go through Parliament. But overall, I think certainly if that process doesn't take off, I think the government will probably be quite careful about how it handles it, given what happened in 2015 with the al-Bashir case.
Thank you, Elizabeth. And it's interesting, your last point on the qualified invitation that Putin might receive. And I'll share a little diplomatic anecdote. I was working at the Dutch embassy in Pretoria in the political section in the run-up to the World Cup soccer in South Africa, the FIFA soccer, and of course everyone came to visit. And I was asked by the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs to check whether al-Bashir will be visiting during the same time when the Dutch officials were gonna come to South Africa. And then I called up Dirko, South Africa's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and I asked the question whether Bashir will be attending, and I got a very awkward response saying, quote unquote, that we invited Mr. Bashir but we told them, unfortunately, we will have to arrest you if you come. But of course, that was in the run-up to World Cup soccer. And of course, 5 years later, he entered South Africa. And as you mentioned, not only those two South African courts said that South Africa failed to adhere to this arrest warrant, but the ICC also subsequently had a ruling to that effect. So the question is whether South Africa will be upholding international law or not. But I guess that's to be found out in the near future. I'd like to really thank you, both Ambassador Abravitova as well as Elizabeth Sidiropoulos, and also, of course, Abdelhak Bassou for joining us. I think this was a great discussion. I do think we need to have more of these discussions also in the Global South on how the Global South is impacted by this war, how are we responding, and think about how that also impacts on our norms and values in these parts of the world. Thank you also for our audience for joining us. We will be back in 2 weeks with another Russia-Ukraine dialogue, and we'll focus on Russian support and opposition to the war. Thank you, everyone, and goodbye.